"Those tears are fake," my daughter-in-law said, her voice carrying across the quiet chapel. "She's just putting on a show." The words hung in the air longer than the scent of lilies that surrounded my husband's casket. I did not turn toward her. I did not defend myself. I simply stood there, one gloved hand resting on the polished oak, staring at the brass plaque that read Thomas Whitmore, 1949 to 2024. 48 years of marriage reduced to 2 dates and a dash between them. The chapel was filled with soft organ music and the low murmur of condolences, but after Olivia spoke, even the music seemed to shrink. A few heads turned. Someone cleared their throat. My son Daniel shifted beside her, but he did not say a word. I felt the weight of that silence more than I felt her accusation. I had chosen a navy wool dress for the service, one Thomas always said made me look dignified. The sleeves felt tight around my wrists as if the fabric itself understood how carefully I was holding myself together. I had not slept in 3 days. Since the hospital room fell quiet and the machines were turned off, the house had felt cavernous, like a museum after hours. Yet I had not cried in front of anyone. Not in the hospital corridor. Not when signing paperwork. Not when the funeral director asked me to confirm the spelling of my husband's name. My grief had been private, measured, steady. And apparently, to Olivia, that meant it was theatrical. I could still hear her tone, light, almost amused, as if she were commenting on the weather instead of my mourning. "Crocodile tears," she added more softly, though not softly enough. The phrase brushed against my back like a cold draft. I remembered the first time she came to dinner at our home 12 years ago. She had complimented the silverware before she complimented the meal. Thomas noticed. He noticed everything. After dessert, he had taken my hand under the table and squeezed it once, a signal we had developed over decades. Pay attention, that squeeze meant. I did not understand then what he was asking me to notice. Now, standing beside his casket, I understood too much. The chapel lights reflected off the framed photographs displayed near the front, Thomas teaching Daniel to ride a bike, Thomas grilling burgers on the 4th of July, Thomas holding our first grandchild with a look of pure wonder. There was no photograph of Olivia in that collection. She had insisted on bringing her own collage board, filled with glossy prints of vacations and holiday parties, most of them taken in the last 5 years. She had positioned it closer to the aisle than my display. A subtle shift, but deliberate. When guests approached me to offer condolences, I thanked them in a calm voice. I listened to stories about Thomas's generosity, his stubborn loyalty to the Chicago Cubs, his habit of tipping 20% even at the corner coffee shop. I nodded and smiled gently, because that is what you do when you love someone deeply and lose them. You honor them by standing steady. From the corner of my eye, I saw Olivia whispering to Daniel. Her hand rested firmly on his forearm, fingers pressed just a little too tightly. He looked pale, thinner than he had a month ago. Grief can do that to a person. So can pressure. When the pastor began the closing prayer, I bowed my head. I felt the tremor in my hands then, a quiet shiver I had managed to suppress all morning. It wasn't from anger. It wasn't even from humiliation. It was from realization. This was not the first time Olivia had tested the boundaries of respect. It was simply the first time she had done it in public, in a room filled with witnesses, under the vaulted ceiling of a church where vows once echoed. I let the tremor pass. I inhaled slowly, counting to 4 the way Thomas had taught me years ago when I was anxious about a job interview. Breathe in, hold, release. Control is a quiet thing. It does not shout. It does not argue in the aisle of a chapel. It waits. As people began filing out toward the reception hall across the street, I remained by the casket for a moment longer. I traced the edge of the wood with my fingertips, memorizing the smoothness. I'll handle it, Thomas had whispered to me 3 nights before he passed, his voice barely audible over the steady hospital hum. At the time, I thought he meant the paperwork, the bank accounts, the insurance policies. I did not realize he meant something larger. When I finally turned away from the casket, my eyes met Olivia's. She gave me a small, tight smile, the kind that never reaches the eyes. I returned it with one of my own. She believed she had exposed me, unmasked some grand performance. She believed grief must be loud to be real. What she did not understand, what she could not possibly understand, was that silence can be stronger than accusation, and patience can be stronger than pride. I walked past her without a word, my heels steady against the stone floor, and let her believe, just for that moment, that I was exactly what she thought I was, a fragile widow with nothing left but tears. The reception was held in the fellowship hall across the street, a rectangular room with folding chairs, long buffet tables, and a large window that overlooked the church parking lot. The February sky was pale and overcast, the kind of gray that flattens everything beneath it. I stood near the coffee urn, pouring cup after cup for guests who thanked me as if I were the hostess of an ordinary gathering instead of a widow learning how to stand without her husband beside her. I kept my posture straight, shoulders relaxed, voice even. I could feel Olivia watching me from across the room. She stood near the dessert table, one hand wrapped around a paper cup, the other resting on Daniel's sleeve. Every few minutes she leaned in to whisper something to him. He nodded more than he spoke. I recognized that pattern. It was the same one I had seen over the past 5 years whenever finances were mentioned at family dinners. Olivia would speak first. Daniel would agree. It was subtle, but it was steady. A woman from Thomas's old accounting firm approached me and pressed my hand gently. She told me he had once stayed late to help her reconcile a complicated report so she could make it home before a snowstorm. I smiled and told her that sounded exactly like him. That was the truth. Thomas had always believed in preparation. He used to say that storms are inevitable, but being caught unprepared is optional. I thought about that now as I watched Olivia laugh softly at something a neighbor said, her voice just a little too bright for the occasion. There is a tone people use when they are relieved. I heard it in her laughter. When the line of guests thinned, Daniel finally approached me. His tie was loosened slightly, and his eyes looked tired. "Mom," he said, clearing his throat, "you held up well today." The phrasing struck me. Held up. As if I were a structure being evaluated for cracks. "Thank you," I replied. "Your father would have appreciated how many people came." Daniel nodded. He glanced over his shoulder before lowering his voice. Olivia did not mean what she said earlier. It has been stressful. I looked at him carefully then. Stress does not invent words, I said gently. It only reveals them. He did not respond. Instead, he pressed his lips together and shifted his weight. Olivia joined us before the silence could deepen. She placed her hand lightly on Daniel's back and offered me a sympathetic expression. "Margaret, everyone handles grief differently," she said, her voice smooth and measured. "Some people cry openly. Some people do not. I just think honesty is important." Honesty. The word hovered between us. I studied her face. Perfectly applied makeup. Pearls at her ears. Not a strand of hair out of place despite the damp air outside. She looked prepared. "You are right," I said. "Honesty matters." Her eyes flickered for a fraction of a second, perhaps surprised by the agreement. She recovered quickly. "Daniel and I were thinking," she continued, "that it might be overwhelming for you to stay alone in the house right now. It is almost 4,000 square feet. That is a lot to manage." There it was. Not even 20 minutes after the final prayer. I felt a small, quiet click inside my mind, like a puzzle piece sliding into place. "I have managed it for 38 years, I replied. "I believe I can manage a few more weeks." Daniel shifted again. "Maybe we can revisit the conversation later," he said, glancing between us. Olivia smiled. "Of course. We just want what is best for you." What is best for you? The phrase was polished, rehearsed. I remembered Thomas's voice in the hospital room 3 nights earlier. "Promise me you will see Harrison," he had said, his hand warm but weak in mine. I had nodded then, though I did not fully understand why he was so insistent. Now I did. Harrison Cole had been Thomas's attorney for more than 20 years. He had handled business contracts, tax filings, and estate planning. Thomas trusted him with details he did not even share with Daniel. As the reception began to thin and guests gathered their coats, Olivia excused herself to take a call near the entrance. I noticed the way her expression changed as soon as she turned away from us. The softness dropped. Her jaw tightened. She spoke quickly, quietly, as if discussing something time-sensitive. When she returned, she looked satisfied. Daniel informed me that they would stop by the house the following morning to help organize paperwork. There are a lot of documents to go through, he said. Insurance, property records, business accounts. Business accounts. I met his eyes. Your father handled those carefully, I said. He believed in structure. Daniel nodded, but I could see uncertainty there, a thin layer beneath the surface. As the last of the guests left, I gathered my coat and gloves. The air outside was colder than I expected, sharp against my cheeks. I paused on the church steps and looked back at the building, its brick facade steady and unchanged. Olivia stood beside Daniel at the bottom of the stairs, speaking animatedly. She did not notice me watching her. I realized then that she believed today had shifted something in her favor. She believed my quietness meant surrender. She believed the absence of tears meant the absence of strength. I stepped carefully down the stone stairs, each heel striking firmly, and joined them without comment. There would be time for conversations. There would be time for documents. And tomorrow, I would call Harrison. I did not sleep much that night. The house felt different without the low hum of Thomas reading in his study or the soft rhythm of his breathing beside me. Every room carried a memory, and every memory carried weight. At 6:30 in the morning, I stood in the kitchen and made coffee the way he liked it, 2 scoops of dark roast for every 6 ounces of water, even though I would be the only one drinking it. Habit can be a comfort when everything else feels uncertain. I carried my mug into the dining room and sat at the long oak table where Daniel had learned to do his homework and where Olivia had once complimented the crown molding before asking about property taxes. The sunlight filtered through the tall windows, catching dust in the air. It was quiet. Measured. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Harrison Cole. My thumb hovered for only a second before I pressed call. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice steady and professional, as it had always been. Margaret, he said gently, I was expecting your call. That sentence alone told me more than any document could have. Thomas insisted, I replied. He asked me to see you. There was a brief pause on the other end, not awkward but deliberate. Yes, Harrison said. He was very clear about that. We agreed to meet at his office at 10 o'clock. I set the phone down and finished my coffee slowly. At 8:45, Daniel and Olivia arrived exactly as promised. I heard the engine of their sedan in the driveway before the doorbell rang. I opened the door myself. Olivia stepped inside first, carrying a leather folder tucked neatly under her arm. Daniel followed, his hands empty. We thought we could start with the filing cabinet in Dad's study, Daniel said, avoiding the word dead. I nodded. I have an appointment this morning, I told them calmly. With Harrison. The reaction was subtle but unmistakable. Olivia's eyebrows lifted slightly. Daniel blinked. Today? He asked. That seems fast. Your father believed in efficiency, I said. So do I. Olivia smiled, but it was thinner than usual. Of course, she replied. We just wanted to make sure everything was organized. Organized. Another careful word. I led them into the study anyway. The room still smelled faintly of Thomas's aftershave and old paper. Shelves lined the walls, filled with binders labeled by year. He had always kept meticulous records. Olivia moved quickly toward the filing cabinet, scanning the drawers as if she expected something specific to reveal itself immediately. Daniel stood near the desk, his hand resting on the back of the leather chair his father had used for decades. Do you know where he kept the business account statements? Olivia asked, her tone casual but focused. I met her eyes. If there is something you need, I said evenly, Harrison will have guidance. She paused at that, her fingers tightening slightly on the edge of the drawer. We just want to avoid delays, she said. There are ongoing contracts. Payroll. Taxes. Her knowledge of those details was thorough. Perhaps more thorough than I had realized. Your father anticipated that, I replied. He rarely left loose ends. Daniel shifted. Mom, we are just trying to help. I studied my son carefully. There was sincerity in his voice, but also uncertainty, as if he were navigating instructions he did not fully understand. I know, I said gently. And I appreciate that. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 9:35. I need to leave in 15 minutes. Olivia closed the drawer and straightened. Maybe we should all go, she suggested quickly. It might be helpful if we hear everything together. There it was. The eagerness to be present. To witness. To interpret. I slipped my coat over my shoulders. Harrison asked to speak with me first, I said. Privately. The word landed softly but firmly. Daniel looked at Olivia before nodding. That makes sense, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. I stepped outside into the crisp morning air and locked the front door behind me. As I walked to my car, I felt their eyes on my back. The drive to Harrison's office took 20 minutes, passing familiar streets lined with maple trees still bare from winter. The radio remained off. Silence allowed thoughts to settle into clarity. Thomas had not been a man of grand gestures. He believed in quiet preparation. If he had insisted I meet Harrison immediately, there was reason. When I pulled into the parking lot of the brick office building, I felt something steady settle inside me. Not anger. Not fear. Something closer to understanding. Whatever Olivia believed she had secured with a single sentence in a chapel, she had miscalculated one essential fact. Thomas Whitmore had never left anything important to chance. Harrison Cole's office was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a quiet hallway that smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh paper. The receptionist greeted me by name before I even reached the desk, which told me Thomas had prepared more than I realized. I was led into a corner office with large windows overlooking the street below. Cars moved steadily through the late morning traffic, ordinary and unaware of the quiet shift taking place inside that room. Harrison stood when I entered. He did not offer excessive sympathy. He simply extended his hand and held it firmly. Margaret, he said, I am very sorry. I thanked him and sat across from his desk, placing my handbag neatly at my feet. The office walls were lined with framed certifications and shelves of leather-bound volumes. Everything felt structured, intentional. Harrison opened a thick folder and adjusted his glasses. Thomas updated several documents 6 months ago, he began. He did so quietly. I felt a small tightening in my chest, not from fear but from recognition. 6 months ago was when Olivia first began asking detailed questions about quarterly profits at a family barbecue. She had leaned against the kitchen counter and asked Daniel whether the company might consider expanding leadership. At the time, I thought it was curiosity. Now I understood it was calculation. Your husband established an irrevocable trust, Harrison continued. The primary beneficiary is you. The controlling authority also remains with you unless certain conditions are met. I listened without interrupting. The word irrevocable carried weight. It meant fixed. Unchangeable. Daniel? I asked calmly. Harrison folded his hands. Daniel is listed as a successor beneficiary. However, he does not assume control automatically. There are stipulations. Stipulations. Thomas had always believed in conditions, in earned responsibility. Harrison turned a page and slid a document toward me. Your husband included what he referred to as a conduct clause. I raised my eyes slightly. A conduct clause? Yes, Harrison said. Any individual who publicly undermines, defames, or attempts to manipulate the primary beneficiary during a period of mourning forfeits their claim to direct financial authority. The room felt very still. I did not gasp. I did not lean back dramatically. I simply absorbed the sentence piece by piece. Publicly undermines. During a period of mourning. Forfeits their claim. Thomas had chosen his words carefully. Harrison continued, his tone steady. There is also documentation authorizing temporary account restrictions if such behavior is verified. I thought of Olivia's voice in the chapel. Crocodile tears. I thought of her suggestion that I should downsize less than an hour after the service ended. Verified how? I asked. Harrison opened another folder and placed a small digital recorder on the desk between us. The service was recorded, he said. At Thomas's request. Audio and visual. I felt a slow warmth spread through my chest, not anger but something closer to clarity. Thomas had known. He had anticipated pressure. He had prepared evidence. Harrison leaned forward slightly. Margaret, your husband was concerned that grief might be interpreted as vulnerability. He wanted to ensure you were protected not only legally but reputationally. I folded my hands in my lap. He always believed storms reveal character, I said quietly. Harrison gave a faint nod. He believed that very strongly. He proceeded to explain the structure of the business accounts. Payroll was secured through an automated trust management system. No single individual could withdraw substantial funds without dual authorization, one of which now required my signature. Property deeds were also placed within the trust. The house, the vacation property in Michigan, and the company's shares were insulated from impulsive transfer. Thomas had constructed a framework that required patience and integrity to navigate. As Harrison outlined the details, I felt the narrative of the past 24 hours rearranging itself in my mind. Olivia's urgency. Her insistence on attending this meeting. Her interest in immediate document review. Each action now appeared less random and more predictable. Harrison closed the folder gently. Margaret, you have full discretion. You may enforce the clause immediately, or you may observe further behavior before taking action. I appreciated that phrasing. Observe further behavior. It implied choice. Control. I stood slowly, smoothing the front of my coat. For now, I said, we observe. Harrison walked me to the door. Your husband trusted your judgment, he said quietly. He believed you would know when to act. As I stepped back into the hallway, the light from the windows seemed brighter than before. The building felt the same, the city outside unchanged, yet something inside me had shifted. Olivia believed yesterday's comment had exposed weakness. In reality, it had activated a safeguard she did not even know existed. Thomas had not left anything important to chance. And I, apparently, had not been left unprotected at all. When I returned home from Harrison's office, the house did not feel heavy anymore. It felt watchful. The late morning sun stretched across the hardwood floors, highlighting the familiar grain in the wood Thomas had insisted on choosing himself nearly 20 years ago. I set my keys down in the ceramic bowl by the entryway and removed my coat slowly, deliberately. Through the window I could see Daniel's car still parked at the curb. They had not left. I paused for a moment, smoothing my hair, allowing my breathing to settle into a calm rhythm. Control, I reminded myself, is quiet. When I stepped into the living room, Olivia was seated at the dining table with several folders spread neatly in front of her. Daniel stood near the fireplace, holding one of Thomas's framed photographs as if unsure where to put it. They both looked up at the same time. How did it go? Daniel asked. His tone carried something between curiosity and concern. I placed my handbag on the sideboard before answering. Productive, I said evenly. Olivia leaned back slightly in her chair. Did Harrison go over the business accounts? She asked, as if the question were casual. I noticed she did not ask how I was feeling. She did not ask whether I needed rest. Only about accounts. He reviewed everything thoroughly, I replied. Your father believed in structure. I saw a flicker of impatience cross her face before she masked it with a polite nod. Daniel set the photograph back on the mantel. Mom, Olivia, and I were thinking, he began, glancing toward her for reassurance, that it might be wise to consolidate some responsibilities sooner rather than later. The company is in a transitional period. Transitional. Another careful word. I walked toward the table and glanced at the folders she had opened. Tax returns. Property tax assessments. A printed estimate for real estate staging services. I lifted one page gently between my fingers. Staging? I asked, my voice soft. Olivia clasped her hands together. Just exploring options, she said smoothly. If you decided to sell, the market is strong right now. Homes in this neighborhood are listing for over $1.2 million. She had done her research. I placed the paper back down exactly where I had found it. I have not decided to sell, I said. Daniel exhaled slowly. We just want to make sure you are not overwhelmed, he repeated. The phrase echoed from the day before. I am not overwhelmed, I answered. I am informed. The room grew still. Olivia's fingers tapped lightly against the folder before she stilled them. Of course, she said. We are all on the same team. I met her gaze directly. Teams function best when everyone understands the rules, I replied. She held my look for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. There was calculation there, but also uncertainty. She did not know what Harrison had told me. She did not know what Thomas had built behind the scenes. And that uncertainty was beginning to show. Daniel cleared his throat. Did Dad leave specific instructions? He asked carefully. Yes, I said. I allowed the word to settle. He did. Olivia leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Such as, she prompted. I folded my hands in front of me. Such as patience, I said. Such as integrity. And such as proper review before any decisions are made. Daniel frowned slightly. So nothing changes, he asked. Everything changes, I replied calmly. But not impulsively. Olivia closed one of the folders with a soft snap. We should probably schedule a meeting with the company's financial officers, she suggested. To ensure continuity. Harrison will coordinate any necessary meetings, I said. Through me. That last phrase was intentional. Through me. Silence followed. Daniel looked between us, as if sensing an invisible line drawn across the room. Olivia rose from her chair and gathered the papers into neat stacks. We are only trying to help, she said again, but her tone had cooled. I know, I answered gently. And I appreciate the intention. I walked toward the kitchen and began filling the kettle with water. The simple sound of running tap water felt grounding. Behind me, I could hear the faint rustle of folders being placed back into her leather case. When I returned with 3 cups of tea, I set one in front of each of them. Olivia hesitated before accepting hers. Daniel wrapped his hands around the warmth immediately. Your father believed in preparation, I said quietly. He also believed that character reveals itself during difficulty. Neither of them spoke. The ticking of the wall clock seemed louder than usual. I took a slow sip of tea. Across the table, Olivia's posture had shifted. There was less certainty in the way she sat, less assumption in her expression. She had expected compliance. She had expected confusion. Instead, she had encountered structure. And structure is not easily moved. Outside, a delivery truck passed down the street, its engine fading into the distance. The house remained steady. So did I. The following morning began with a silence that felt deliberate, as if the house itself were listening. I woke before sunrise and walked through each room slowly, pausing at the study door before stepping inside. Thomas's desk remained exactly as he had left it, a fountain pen resting beside a yellow legal pad filled with neat, deliberate handwriting. I did not read the notes. I simply touched the edge of the desk and allowed myself one steady breath. By 9 o'clock, Daniel had sent a message saying he and Olivia would stop by the company office to check on transitional matters. The phrasing was familiar now, polished and strategic. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I called Harrison. "It may begin today," I told him calmly. There was no surprise in his voice. "If they attempt access without authorization, the system will flag it," he said. "You will receive confirmation." I thanked him and ended the call. At 10:15, my phone vibrated softly on the kitchen counter. A notification from the bank. Attempted login to executive account. Authorization pending secondary approval. I dried my hands carefully on a linen towel before picking up the phone. Seconds later, another notification appeared. Access denied. I imagined Olivia seated in the modern glass office Daniel had inherited in title but not yet in authority, her expression tightening as the screen refused her entry. I pictured Daniel beside her, confused, perhaps embarrassed. The system was not dramatic. It did not accuse. It simply required proper credentials. At 11 o'clock, Daniel called. I let it ring twice before answering. "Mom," he began, trying to keep his tone neutral, "there seems to be a technical issue with the company accounts." "Is there?" I asked gently. "We were attempting to review payroll projections, but the access protocol changed." There was a pause, as if he were waiting for me to express surprise. "That is not a technical issue," I said evenly. "That is a safeguard." I could hear Olivia's faint whisper in the background, sharp and urgent. Daniel lowered his voice. "Did you authorize this?" "Yes," I replied. Silence followed. Not confusion this time, but recognition. "Mom, we were only trying to make sure everything runs smoothly," he said. "And it will," I answered. "With proper oversight." I ended the call politely. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain further. Structure speaks for itself. By early afternoon, Harrison sent a brief confirmation email stating that the conduct clause had been formally acknowledged and that any further attempts to bypass authorization would require written justification. The wording was clean and precise. I printed the email and placed it inside a folder labeled Estate Matters. I chose the label intentionally. Not conflict. Not dispute. Simply Estate Matters. Later that evening, Daniel and Olivia arrived unannounced. The doorbell rang at 6:20. I opened the door to find Olivia standing slightly ahead of Daniel, her posture straight but her smile strained. "We need to talk," she said. The urgency was no longer hidden beneath courtesy. I stepped aside and allowed them in. The living room felt calm, almost serene, as if it were aware that emotion would not dictate events here. Daniel began pacing lightly near the fireplace. "Mom, locking us out makes this look adversarial," he said. "It is not adversarial," I replied. "It is procedural." Olivia crossed her arms. "You are overreacting to one comment," she said, her composure thinning. I met her gaze without hostility. "Words spoken publicly carry weight," I answered. "Especially during a funeral." Her eyes flickered, and for a brief second I saw uncertainty replace confidence. "That was not meant literally," she insisted. "Intent does not erase impact," I said quietly. Daniel stopped pacing. "So what happens now?" he asked. I folded my hands in my lap. "Now," I said, "we move forward carefully. With transparency. And with respect." The room grew still. Olivia opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. For the first time since the chapel, she appeared unsure of the ground beneath her. Thomas had prepared for storms. He had built walls not to exclude, but to protect. And now, as I sat calmly in the home we had built together, I understood that protection does not require noise. It requires clarity. and clarity had just begun to settle in. The next 2 days unfolded with a calm that felt almost unnatural, like the stillness before a summer thunderstorm. Daniel did not call the morning after our conversation, and Olivia remained silent as well, which told me more than any confrontation could have. People who are confident in their position do not retreat into quiet strategy. They act openly. I spent those days in deliberate routine. I reviewed household accounts, paid utility bills, and walked through each room of the house making small decisions about what to keep and what to store. Structure is built in small acts. On the third morning, Harrison called before 8 o'clock. There has been another attempt, he said plainly. A request was submitted to the board to accelerate executive transition. I stood by the kitchen window, watching a delivery truck make its way down the street. Was it approved? I asked. It was declined automatically, he replied. The trust documentation supersedes the board's discretion at this stage. I thanked him and ended the call. Less than an hour later, Daniel arrived alone. I could tell from the way he rang the bell twice that he was unsettled. When I opened the door, he stepped inside quickly, removing his coat as if bracing himself. Mom, why is the board saying their hands are tied? He asked without greeting. I gestured toward the living room. Because they are, I said gently. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from his teenage years whenever he felt cornered. Olivia thought we could request provisional oversight, he explained. But they said there is a clause that prevents it. I sat down slowly, folding my hands in my lap. There is, I confirmed. His eyes searched my face. Did you know about this? I do now, I said calmly. The weight of that sentence settled between us. Daniel exhaled sharply and began pacing near the fireplace. Mom, this makes it look like we are trying to take something from you. Are you? I asked softly. He stopped. For a moment, he did not answer. The silence stretched long enough to reveal discomfort. We are trying to protect the company, he finally said. I studied him carefully. Protection requires trust, I replied. And trust requires respect. He looked down at the floor. I could see the internal conflict in him, the tug between loyalty to his wife and the memory of the father who had built everything from the ground up. Olivia feels blindsided, he admitted. She thought Dad intended for us to step in immediately. I rose from my chair and walked toward the mantel where Thomas's photograph stood. I adjusted the frame slightly, aligning it with the edge of the shelf. Your father believed leadership was earned over time, I said quietly. Not assumed during grief. Daniel's shoulders dropped. She said you are punishing her, he added carefully. I turned to face him. I am enforcing structure, I replied. There is a difference. He opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. She is frustrated, he said after a pause. Frustration reveals priorities, I answered. The room grew still. Daniel looked older than his 45 years in. That moment, as if the illusion of immediate authority had been quietly dismantled. What do you want from us? He asked finally. The question was not defiant. It was weary. I considered it thoughtfully. I want transparency, I said. I want patience. And I want acknowledgement that what happened in that chapel mattered. His jaw tightened slightly. It was a comment, he insisted. It was a public statement during a funeral, I corrected gently. He did not argue again. Instead, he sat down across from me and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. She feels you are shutting her out, he said. I am setting boundaries, I replied. If that feels like exclusion, then perhaps expectations were misplaced. The front door opened quietly then, and Olivia stepped inside without knocking. She must have used the spare key Daniel carried. Her expression was composed, but her eyes were sharper than usual. We need to discuss this as a family, she said firmly. I met her gaze without rising. We are discussing it, I replied. She crossed the room and stood near Daniel, placing a hand on his shoulder. Your actions are escalating tension, she said. You are creating division. I folded my hands calmly. Division occurs when respect is fractured, I answered. Structure simply reveals where the fracture began. For the first time, I saw genuine uncertainty flicker across her face. She had expected resistance perhaps, but not composure. Not documentation. Not systems that responded without emotion. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, bending branches without breaking them. Inside, the house remained steady. And so did I. Olivia did not leave that afternoon with the same certainty she had carried in. She stood near the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm, as if recalculating. When the door closed behind them, the house exhaled into quiet again. I remained seated in the living room, watching the late light stretch across the carpet, and I considered how quickly confidence shifts when structure interrupts ambition. The following morning, Harrison requested that I attend a formal review meeting at the company headquarters. The board had decided it was time to clarify the chain of authority in writing. I agreed without hesitation. At 10 o'clock sharp, I walked into the conference room Thomas had once described as the engine room. The long walnut table gleamed under recessed lighting, and floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline in pale winter sunlight. Daniel sat halfway down the table, his posture stiff. Olivia was seated beside him, a leather portfolio open in front of her. Several board members nodded politely as I entered. Harrison stood near the head of the table with a thin stack of documents arranged neatly in front of him. I took my seat calmly. The air carried a restrained tension, not dramatic, but present. Harrison began by summarizing the structure of the trust in clear, measured language. He explained the conduct clause again, outlining its intent and scope without emotion. The primary beneficiary retains full executive oversight, he said, his tone steady. Any attempt to circumvent that oversight triggers automatic review and suspension of expanded authority. I noticed Olivia's fingers tighten slightly around her pen. Daniel stared at the polished surface of the table. One of the board members, an older gentleman who had worked alongside Thomas for more than 20 years, cleared his throat gently. Thomas was explicit, he said. He wanted continuity without coercion. The word coercion lingered. I felt Olivia shift beside Daniel. No one is coercing anyone, she said quickly, her voice controlled but sharper than usual. Harrison did not look at her. He simply continued. Additionally, he said, the events during the funeral service have been documented and reviewed as relevant context under the conduct clause. Silence settled across the table. Daniel's head lifted abruptly. Olivia's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. It was the look of someone who suddenly realizes that a private assumption has become a recorded fact. That was an emotional moment, she said, her voice softer now. Grief affects everyone differently. I folded my hands neatly in front of me. It does, I agreed. The board member nodded slowly. Respect is not situational, he said. The meeting proceeded with formal clarity. Payroll structures were reviewed. Vendor contracts were confirmed. Authority lines were restated in writing. Every decision was documented. There was no shouting. No accusations. Only procedure. And procedure, when steady, has a way of diminishing theatrics. By the end of the meeting, it was evident that executive control would remain exactly where Thomas had placed it. Daniel would continue in his current operational role, but any major financial decision required my authorization. Olivia closed her portfolio quietly, her movements measured. The confidence she once carried into rooms had thinned into something more cautious. As the meeting adjourned, Daniel lingered near the doorway. Mom, he said quietly, avoiding direct eye contact, I did not realize it would go this far. I looked at him carefully. Neither did I replied. Outside, the city moved forward without pause. Cars merged into traffic. Pedestrians crossed intersections. Life continued. Inside the conference room, however, something had shifted permanently. Authority had not been seized or wrestled. It had simply remained where it was always meant to be. As I stepped into the elevator with Harrison, he glanced at me briefly. "Your husband anticipated pressure," he said. "He trusted your composure." I nodded. "Composure," I replied softly, "is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of clarity." When I returned home that afternoon, the house felt lighter, not because conflict had ended, but because uncertainty had narrowed. Olivia believed she could destabilize with a single sentence in a chapel. What she had not understood was that Thomas had prepared for storms long before the first cloud appeared. And now, every attempt to accelerate control only revealed the structure he had built beneath our lives. The days following the board meeting were quieter, but not peaceful. There is a difference. Quiet can still carry tension beneath its surface, like a lake that looks calm while currents move below. Daniel returned to work under the clarified structure, and Olivia, for the first time since Thomas passed, stopped coming to the house unannounced. I noticed the absence immediately. The doorbell did not ring unexpectedly. The driveway remained empty in the evenings. Silence, when chosen rather than imposed, feels different. 1 week after the meeting, I invited Daniel to dinner. I did not extend the invitation to Olivia. It was not a punishment. It was a boundary. He arrived at 6 o'clock sharp, carrying a bottle of wine he knew I would not open. We sat at the same oak table where he once studied for his college exams, the same table where Olivia had first asked about expansion strategies between bites of roast chicken years ago. I served a simple meal: baked salmon, steamed asparagus, and rice. Familiar. Grounded. We ate for several minutes without speaking about the company. The clink of silverware against porcelain sounded almost ceremonial. Finally, Daniel set his fork down. "She feels embarrassed," he said quietly. I met his eyes. "Embarrassment often follows reflection," I replied. He exhaled slowly. She did not think the funeral comment would be taken seriously. "Funerals are serious," I said gently. "Your father was serious about respect." Daniel looked toward the window, where the streetlights had just flickered on outside. "She thought you were pretending," he admitted. I allowed that to sit between us. "Grief does not perform," I said. "It endures." He nodded once, as if something inside him was aligning. "Did Dad really anticipate all of this?" he asked. "Yes," I answered. "He anticipated pressure. He did not anticipate cruelty." Daniel lowered his gaze. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The weight in the room was not anger. It was understanding arriving slowly. "I should have said something that day," he said finally. The admission was quiet, almost fragile. I studied my son carefully. The boy who once scraped his knees learning to ride a bicycle had grown into a man navigating ambition, marriage, and legacy all at once. "Yes," I replied softly. "You should have." The honesty did not fracture us. It steadied us. After dinner, Daniel helped clear the table without being asked. Small gestures matter. As he prepared to leave, he paused near the front door. "What happens now?" he asked. It was the same question he had asked before, but the tone had shifted. There was less urgency, more humility. "Now we move forward properly," I said. "With time." 2 days later, Olivia requested a meeting. Not at the company. Not at the house. At a quiet cafe downtown. I agreed. When I arrived, she was already seated near the window, her posture composed but her expression subdued. There were no folders this time. No leather portfolio. Just a cup of untouched coffee. "I misjudged you," she said after a brief greeting. The words were not dramatic. They were measured. I listened without interruption. "I thought control would transfer quickly," she continued. "I assumed that was the practical course." "Practicality without empathy feels cold," I replied calmly. She nodded slightly. "I did not intend to undermine you," she said. "But I did." The admission lingered. There was no apology shaped like a performance. Only acknowledgement. I folded my hands on the table. Respect is not optional during grief, I said. It is foundational. She looked down at her coffee, then back at me. I understand. That now. We sat in silence for a moment, not hostile, not reconciled, but clear. When I left the cafe, the city air felt lighter. Resolution does not always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives in recognition. Thomas had built structures to withstand storms, but he had also trusted that clarity would eventually surface. Authority remained where it belonged. Boundaries were intact. And for the first time since that sentence echoed in the chapel, I felt something steady return to its rightful place. Not victory. Not revenge. Simply dignity, restored without noise.